All right. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Center for Innovation, Design, and Digital Learning second webinar in our series on Universal Design for Learning. Today, we are going to talk about UDL and inclusive early childhood education with a focus on supporting all young children and their families as we train pre-service educators and related service providers. And we're specifically going to talk about our coursework preparation, our foundational principles, and our field work. So thank you all so much for joining us. We are happy to have you here synchronously, or if you're joining us remotely and asynchronously a little bit later, we'll talk about ways we can all connect, even if you aren't with us here right now. So we are very, very fortunate to have a great group of esteemed panelists to join us today for this conversation. I'm going to let each of our panelists introduce themselves in just a minute. I'm Dr. Katie Zimmerman, and I'm a co-PI here with the Siddle Center. And I have a personal interest in educator preparation around early childhood, particularly around that preschool to third grade age group. So we'll start with Dr. Eva Horn.
Well, hello, everyone. So I'm Eva Horn, and I'm a faculty member at the University of Kansas, and I coordinate our Early Childhood Unified, as we call it in our state, which is a fully blended educator preparation program for birth through 8 years of age. We also have actually a master's program that goes birth to kindergarten for initial teaching license. And then we also have a doctoral program, and we've had that program in place for, over 9 years now. And so this particular topic, Universal Design for Learning, is absolutely central to some of the work that I've done, both in my preparation, but also in my research activities. And I'm going to put in one additional plug. Sorry. You asked me to introduce myself, even though I have a very short name.
Go for it, Eva.
I am originally a Southerner, and so, I can't say my name, even though it's short. I can't say it in less than 10 minutes. So anyway, the other thing I'd like to put a plug in is that I would just recently finished chairing the DEC CEC task force on personnel preparation standards for early intervention, early childhood special ed. Yes, for the first time, we have our own standalone standards. I also, at the same time, served on NAEYC as they were doing their professional standards and competencies for early childhood educators. And so I'm finding myself really absolutely immersed in the field of early childhood. And my perspectives on universal design are heavily influenced by the work that I've been doing together with NAEYC. So that's it. I'm done. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Eva.
Should I jump in, Katie?
Absolutely.
All right, good. Hello, I was about to say good morning. Forgive me. I'm on the West Coast. It's still morning-ish over here. I'm Ariane Govro. It's so lovely to be here. Such an honor to be here with my colleagues. I'm coming to you from Seattle, Washington at the University of Washington, where I'm Senior Director of Professional Development and Training at the Herring Center. Prior to coming into this role, I was a clinical faculty member and the field director in the special education program. So had the incredible pleasure of working with teacher candidates as they moved through our master's program, becoming duly certified in special education with an endorsement in various general education areas. And the work that we're doing now at the Herring Center is very much around PD and coaching across birth to 3 settings through transition settings. I'm certainly an early childhood person. That is close to my heart. I was an EI provider, a preschool teacher before kind of coming back into higher education. But it's really, really amazing having the opportunity to have conversations with teachers and school leaders and stakeholders and PTSA groups about universal design for learning and how it can be supportive of our families, of our parents, of our community members, and of the learners in our school building. So I'm really excited to continue this conversation today, to hear from colleagues, and to connect with this incredible Siddle community as folks are thinking about ensuring this is a part of our pre-service preparation. So folks are entering the field feeling so confident with their ability to design environments and activities and lessons and ways of communicating with families as we think about these UDL frameworks. And Marla, I'll pass it to you.
Thank you. I am Dr. Marla Lohman. I'm an associate professor of special education at Colorado Christian University. So I am coming to you from the mountains in Denver, or just outside of Denver. My program is a K-12 initial licensure master's program. But most of my work is in preschool through second grade, as well as in effective teacher prep. And UDL is such an integral part of all of that, how we effectively teach all children, but also how we effectively teach future teachers. And I find that the UDL components and using the UDL framework just makes for a much stronger teacher prep program. My students come out with just much more knowledge and are much more excited about learning as we use the UDL framework. I am also the co-chair of the Early Childhood Special Interest Group for TED, which is the CEC Teacher Education Division, which this group is faculty who work in early childhood, birth through age 8, so also those of us who are K-12. And that's a great opportunity to connect and talk about how we use UDL and other really solid frameworks to support teacher preparation.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Thank you, Eva and Ariane and Marla for joining us. So as y'all can see, we have a wide variety of perspectives and folks who are hitting some of those areas. And we do really want to emphasize that, you know, we're here partnering, we're all part of multiple organizations. And so we're excited to have this common conversation around inclusive early childhood and UDL. And so just some logistics, if you are joining us synchronously and live, please share your questions, your comments, introduce yourselves in the chat. We've got people monitoring it. If you're joining us asynchronously and you're watching this after the fact, we'll have this at the end of the webinar, but we hope that you're introducing yourself and chatting and connecting with us around this information and content and your thoughts in the CITL community, which again, we'll give you guys, make sure that you have access to and know how to connect with as we're done. So even if you're asynchronous, we have a chance to talk about this as a community. We know there's a lot of great thinkers out there, and we've highlighted 3 of them today, so we're excited for that connection. So just to kind of frame where we're headed in this webinar and what we expect to discuss and to have conversation around, we have 2 foundational principles that are guiding our conversation today. And the first are some foundational beliefs that we have in early childhood and that we have as early childhood educators, early interventionists, early childhood special educators, speech and language pathologists, occupational therapists, physical therapists, infant mental health and wellness. When you're faculty and we're supporting these wide range of areas, we have a lot of things to think about, and we may be doing that in perhaps different arenas or areas or experiences, but we do have some foundational core things that we all agree with and that we all hold central to our core beliefs, and we're going to start with those. We're going to connect those to equity and universal design for learning and inclusivity for all young children and their families, and how we can support the folks who are in our training programs to be able to support all kids and families. And then we're going to connect them to some of these brand new professional practice standards that Eva highlighted and some fieldwork experiences, particularly that are going on, for example, around the Herring Center, so that we can support folks who are engaging in their training. And I see people are starting to introduce themselves in the chat, and I know that I'm going to be hopping in Mighty too, so I'm sure I'm going to be seeing people there. We have a connection to that online community here in the chat, so thank you all so much for joining. And so let's hop right in and connect our first foundational belief that all of us here in the webinar want to highlight and recognize this commonality despite the variability in perhaps our experiences or training. Awesome, we've got someone here that works for First Steps to Success. Welcome, we're so excited to have you. And so our first foundational belief is that all children have the right to equitable learning opportunities that enable them to achieve their full potential as engaged learners and valued members of society. And we have our guiding principle and belief from this that is directly from our NAEYC Advancing Equity in Early Childhood position statement. You can access that through the QR code here on this slide, and then we'll also make sure that it's available in our CITL community as well so that you can access it fully. Our second foundational belief is that our goal at institutes of higher education, whether that's a 2-year or a 4-year institution, whether we're training folks at the undergraduate or graduate level in a variety of fields that relate to early childhood and early intervention, our goal is to prepare educators to promote each child's optimal development and learning through a strengths-based, play-based approach to joyful and engaged learning. And NAEYC has highlighted that through our developmentally appropriate practices. And the third foundational belief that we want to highlight and trigger our initial conversation is that all children can learn and achieve when they're provided with a high quality general education curriculum, services, and supports to match their needs. And I think all of us here would also add, and so would DEC, their strengths as well. And so that we just have a brand new position statement that has come out on multi-tiered systems of support and the framework to do that in early childhood. And so some of these partner organizations that have been mentioned, NAEYC and DEC, have put out some foundational beliefs and goals as a field that we hold core to our practice. And so I want to take a moment now with our panelists to reflect on these foundational beliefs. So what do y'all think these foundational beliefs, how can that influence us in higher education? How can it influence our thinking or talking about supporting children and their families as we prepare educators and related service providers?
So I'll jump in. One of my favorite, and I use it over and over these days, is the notion of joyful learning, joyful engaged learning. And I just think that is so critical to truly our foundational beliefs. We want each and every child to have that opportunity for joyful, engaged. And I think the joyful is really important, but so is the engaged, and the two go hand in hand. If I'm feeling joyful, I'm more likely to be engaged, and then I'm more likely to grow and develop. And so I think, you know, for us to really embrace that, and it is our sister organization as early childhood special educators that have that really brought that to the front. And I think that, you know, is a belief that we held. But isn't it wonderful that these two organizations now are really embracing this idea of, and, you know, you can really see this strength-based is something that's been part of what we've talked about for years. And so, you know, I do think that, you know, if you only have one takeaway, it is to really embrace that notion, and think about how do we, as educator preparation folks, how do we instill that feeling of this is my mission to do. So I'll stop and let some of my other panelists say.
Sorry.
Marla, go ahead.
That was actually, those were the exact same words that, as we were looking at those slides again, were jumping out at me. And I was thinking about it from a teacher standpoint. We want our kids to be joyful and we want them to be engaged. Sorry, it's really windy where I'm at. And so I think the wind is impacting the ability to hear.
We can't hear it.
At all?
No, we can hear you. We can't hear the wind.
Okay. But the words joyful and engaged, as a teacher, when our students are more joyful and engaged, it is just frankly more fun to teach as well. Like we, you know, when we're looking at our students, whether they are preschool students, 3-year-olds, 7-year-olds, or adult pre-service teachers, when they are joyfully and engaged in their learning, it is just so much more fun to teach. And you can see their learning being so much deeper. And I'm thinking about it from a teacher prep standpoint. When I'm really good about using the UDL framework in my teacher prep, in my coursework, my students are way more engaged, and they are very clear with me that they are having a blast, and they go so much deeper into the learning when we make it engaging and fun, and we bring out that joy. So that joy is not just for our kids or our teacher candidates, but it's also for us. It's a whole lot more fun to look at their work and to work with them when we are creating an environment that's joyful and engaging.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I of course so agree with what colleagues have mentioned earlier. I think that UDL is such a powerful tool, and it helps us really think, you know, flexibly and creatively as educators, both in classrooms, as Marla mentioned, in our classrooms as faculty members, you know, the work that we get to do with in-service teachers, because we know that individuals can engage in a variety of ways. And like the way that our friends at CITL have designed this webinar is an incredible example of that, right? Like we've got folks joining in the chat from all over the globe. We have people that are connecting via YouTube Live. And then we have a lot of opportunities that we can follow up with this conversation or watch this, at another time asynchronously for folks that weren't able to join in here. And it just makes me think about the ways, that we can design activities in our early learning classrooms and in our home childcare facilities, wherever our young children are spending time, that ensures that everyone, regardless of their needs and regardless of their strengths, has opportunities to be meaningfully engaged. And I so appreciate how UDL helps us think about, like, all right, circle time. Like Marla and I and our colleague Kate have a little article that talks specifically about UDL at circle time. We do this in all of our classrooms, right? And sometimes it can take up maybe a little bit longer than we might hope it takes up in early learning classrooms. I always think of the study where researchers ask kids about their ideas around circle time in preschoolers. Some of them were like, yeah, it kind of takes a long time. I don't like it because it takes too long. So it's always in my head when we're talking about circle. But anyways, examples of how we can use UDL to ensure that all members of our community, as we go through a circle time routine, are engaged by using props and visuals and different types of books and other ways that children can share their ideas and make connections to their homes and their communities. So I really appreciate Eva centering us on joyful, engaged learning is what we want for every child within our communities. And I see the UDL frameworks as a tool and a resource to help us design these activities and these environments where children really can be engaged in that way.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. I see Michelle in the chat. She actually found that article that y'all wrote. So if folks are interested, we'll make sure to share it in the community as well. And I'm hearing y'all talk about joyful and engaged learning. And, sometimes I struggle with how do we, we have these skills that families identify as priorities, or we have these skills that we identify in our professional groups, or that from a certification standpoint, we need to be able to have our students who are in our classrooms at universities be able to demonstrate a lot of these skills. And so how do you all promote that joy and engagement in learning within the higher education context, knowing that, we're training people to work in a variety of settings? I'm in the upper side of early childhood, and so the variability in setting is a little bit smaller for me personally. But what are some ways, I heard you guys talking about UDL gives you a framework or a way to think about these joyful, engaged experiences so that multiple kids can be engaged. Because what brings joy to me might not be the same as something that brings joy to Marla, but we're in the same classroom, or we're both students learning together. So how do you guys use UDL to create these engaging experiences, or to support our future educators or related service providers in doing so? Go for it, Eva. Eva or Marla, you both have looks like you're thinking about something.
I was going to actually ping pong it or popcorn it, or whatever that expression is, over to Marla, because she started talking about how she uses it in higher ed.
So in the higher ed classroom, I use a lot of choice. And when I'm creating assessments in my classes, I really think about what is the purpose of the assessment. So if I need them to practice writing an IFSP or an IEP, well, there's no choice there, right? They have to write that. And they have to know how to write that. And they have to know how to write a lesson plan. But when it comes down to them showing me that they understand the concept, if the goal of my assignment is just to know that they understand the concept of UDL, they can show me in any way they want. And so choice is a big thing I do. And because my students are graduate students and they're grown-ups and I don't need to hold their hands, I generally do a lot of unlimited choice. So here are the things you must cover in your submission, but you can write a paper, you can do a video, you can create a visual, you can do an interpretive dance, as long as you can show me what you need. And then my rubric will look at, what are the things I really wanted them to show me and convey to me, but not, so I won't be looking for grammatical errors in my rubric, or I won't be looking at, presentation style. My rubric will be very focused on what was the content I needed them to convey to me, and did they convey it? And I'm in the middle actually of conducting a study, a survey of my students on their thoughts on this whole choice-based assignments, because I use them in several classes. And the preliminary results that I'm still in the middle of wading through really do indicate that students love them and they get excited when the prompt for the assignment says in a manner of your choosing, because they know that they can do it how they want. And I find as I grade them that they go way more in depth than I would have asked them to, because they start to get excited and they start to have joy and get engaged. And there's a lot more fun. And I will say, as an instructor, when I have 50 or 60 students in a class and I'm grading 50 or 60 assignments, when they're choice-based assignments, you can feel the joy as you're grading, but it's also a lot more fun to grade 60 of a variety of assignments versus 60 papers. A whole lot more fun. But I would say choice is one way that I do a lot of it. And I try to offer choice whenever I can. And even when there's not a lot of choice, I try to put some choice in the assignment. So if they're writing an IEP, they get to choose the student. Or if they're writing a lesson plan, there's some level of choice. And that's one small way that I've started to really utilize the UDL framework in teacher prep, is just the idea of choice whenever I can.
Mm-hmm. I have the same approach, Marla. I so appreciate what you're saying about also as we're assessing that as instructors. It's just so much. It's nice to be able to mix it up and read a little bit. I've had students do the same thing, and someone kind of create a podcast with a colleague that I got to listen to, which was really cool. I've not had a student do an interpretive dance, but like I would be so excited to learn more about how they're thinking about, I teach a class on autism and social communication disorders. But related to choice, I also try to think a little bit about how students are accessing materials, learning activities, learning materials in our class outside of just traditional papers. Right. So we have such incredible resources when it comes to technology and ways of sharing ideas. And I've really tried to challenge myself to look beyond just, academic papers and pull in some really interesting TED Talks and interesting podcasts and the voices of individuals who identify as disabled and autistic themselves via blogs. And I explored kind of some expanding into like asking students to follow disability self-advocates on social media, on Twitter and Instagram, and move that into a kind of a really interesting discussion that we had in class, and then also asynchronously on a discussion board. So I'm appreciating what Marla is saying about choice, and also thinking about how as instructors, when we're designing our syllabus and identifying ways that students are accessing content, that we can think about this outside of just papers and traditional like written work, and move into other funds of knowledge and other ways that people can access that. And then of course, we're so lucky now that text to speech is such a common thing. So we have a lot of students that, I'm in the Seattle area where it takes an hour to get from Seattle to Seattle. And I appreciate students being like, I'm on public transportation a lot. It's really nice to be able to listen to this article or listen to this podcast, as opposed to sitting and reading a book. And again, like technology makes this so much easier than it used to be 5 or 10 years ago.
Yeah, I'll pop in real quick. They've covered, both Marla and Adrienne really covered the, and it's sort of like, I want to say, yeah, exactly. That's how you do it. One of the thoughts that came to me that maybe just adds another dimension to it is, thinking across, all of us are involved in programs, and it's not a course. It's not just a course, that we need to think about that. And I think that's another way that UDL can really help us in terms of, we have, in our undergraduate program, we have 4 years with the students. In our master's program, we have 2 years with the students, and a sequence of courses. And we think about how those courses build upon each other. And, I think about, one of the principles that we use when we think about engagement, definitely choice making, absolutely a part of it, but also one of the things that we're doing to support children's engagement, and in this case, our students, higher education students' engagement, is that we're connecting it to their prior experiences. And so if we think about courses across time that build their competency, we need to be thinking about those intentional overlaps. And, the sort of spiraling curriculum, which I think is a really old term, but I think fits really nicely here, that we use universal design for learning as a way to think about how are we spiraling them through experiences to really build their competence, and quite honestly, probably more than anything, yeah, we want them to have competence in specific skills, but ultimately what we want them to have is a sense of confidence in their competence. That ultimately leads us to, ongoing learners.
Yeah.
So.
I wrote that down. I had to think about that. You said confidence in their competence.
Yes. I think
like
ultimately, we have so much information about, even a lot of the research has, been done around implementation of inclusive practices in early childhood education. And the number one that comes up over and over again, barrier to that happening, is educators' confidence in their ability to support children with a variety of different kinds of abilities and disabilities. And so, much more important to me than that they know how to do X, that they believe that if they don't know, they believe that they know where to go get the support and that they can do it if they just have the support and resources to do it.
Totally. Don't we all wish that we were one of Eva's students? Like,
oh no.
what you're bringing up is also making me think, Eva, about sometimes we can leave this out of the conversation with UDL, but how important it is that so much of our work is grounded in relationships, right? The relationships that we have as faculty members. I'm sorry?
No, I was just saying, yes, you're right. I'm just cheerleading you.
Oh, thank you. I'll take them. Cheerleading me. Lifetime achievement here. But I think that that's such an important way that, as we're designing our courses and thinking about the first time that we might come together, ways in which that we, are striving to build relationships with students. So we know them, we can celebrate that as we're starting to see them pick up these skills and implement them in the field. And of course, I always think about, how we're modeling that the way we would also want to model how students would build relationships with the families and the community members that they're going to be partnering with, or their, classroom team. In early childhood, we have these really large interdisciplinary teams, and teaming and collaboration is such a crucial tool and resource when we think about the implementation of inclusionary practices. And I think as faculty members, that's something that we that can be time well spent in our, the beginning of our courses. I use a tool called Animoto. I'm not sure if other folks have used Animoto before. It's worked really well for me. I'll put a link here in the chat. It's a completely free resource, but it can be a really lovely way to introduce yourselves to your students. It's a tool for creating like a little video about, there's a link in the chat there. That's a really long URL. I'm not quite sure how I did that, but you can sign up for free. And I'll ask students to create a little Animoto and then post it on a discussion board, even in hybrid and face-to-face classes, because it's a way that students can share a little bit about themselves, about their homes, their communities, the different identities that we bring into our space. And then especially, as so many of us probably are continuing to teach online and in hybrid formats, it can be a really lovely way to kind of create this community in online spaces. So, and I appreciate how some of our colleagues, like I've got this anti-racism and UDL book here. That's a fantastic resource that came out recently, and it aligns with, ways in which teachers can center relationships and the building of community and involving students as we, co-create norms and spaces. So I think for us as early childhood faculty, for teachers as they're thinking more about UDL, I'm appreciating the importance of relationships and being in good relationship and in just relationship with the students, and then helping them be in good relationship with one another. As you were talking, Eva, that was kind of what was coming up for me.
I love it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I know Marla might be able to relate to this, so I'll be interested to hear what you think. So I'm in that K2 space. So I code switch between our early childhood community and our school age community. And I'm going to brag a little bit on us, but I think one of the beauties of the early childhood community, and folks who are joining us again live or in our online community or asynchronously, is that this idea that relationships matter. As I've heard, as you all have talked, right? We've talked for about 20 minutes. There's been very little differentiation of, does someone technically receive special education or not? Is a child learning in the community? Is a child learning in a traditional classroom setting? Is a child learning with a caretaker in a home? Is a child learning with a team of caretakers who have a variety of roles in that child's life? It's that at the end of the day, the core and the heart of our foundation as folks who prepare future educators and related service providers is around that teaming and collaboration. But more importantly, perhaps, and I'm not saying that school age does this as well, so please let's get this on the recorded record. School age values this as well, but I think in early childhood in particular, we're focused on the tiny little humans, the humanity in the humans, the humanity in the caretakers, the humanity in educators, and the humanity in our colleagues in higher ed, but also in students in our university classrooms, that's ultimately the basis of what matters. And that the variability that exists in that condition and in that space, that it's our goal to highlight strengths and how folks identify and to have a space for that conversation to happen. And that UDL is a way to consider, well, I don't have to necessarily plan for, quote, the special education services, although we do, but rather I'm going to plan for everyone who I'm teaching, whether it's in higher ed or in an early childhood context. And in planning for everyone, we're providing equitable access and opportunity for everyone. And that is really the frame where we enter supporting young children and families. It's not what classification, whether it's a funding source to access early childhood, depending on where you are in the country, or whether it's, do you technically receive additional services and supports or not? But it's that our expectation is that all families and children receive supports and services that are specific and culturally relevant and important and prioritized for them. And it's our job to then be able to find that team, like you said, that confidence and competence. And I don't have to know all the things, but I need to know who or where to go to partner with the things, because one human isn't enough. And so I want to talk to y'all a little bit more about that. And so I've flipped around some slides. Mostly slides are just to make sure, because we could talk about a tangent of a variety of things there to keep us on track. But to connect these beliefs, right? We want to have rigorous educational opportunities, and we have these foundational places, but I really, really appreciate that the majority of this conversation has been around identities and humans, and that we can use these things that are grounded in rigorous evidence and support, but that we do that without, taking apart folks' humanity. And that's really where we start. It's not in the classification system. And I think that gives us a beauty. I want to hear maybe how you guys do that, or what your thoughts are. It gives us a beauty to team and partner, where we don't have to know all the things. We have all these great providers who are with us. I see someone in the chat. Oh, that it does make my soul. This is why I get really excited when I get all the early childhood folks together and I get to sit in a room. So we have a comment in the chat. I'm just going to read it so our folks asynchronously are able to experience it. And this is a direct quote. Okay, I'm like in my kitchen crying because this is like a balm to my soul after a work day yesterday of questioning if everything I believe about teacher prep and early childhood is wrong. And I think that sometimes we get so caught up. Did I meet the accreditation standard? Did we hit all of the competencies for the assessment? Have our fieldwork experiences provided sufficient just time in the global pandemic with supporting children and families? That sometimes it's nice just to come back to the heart of this is why we do it, and this is why we're here, and this is who we value, because we really do value each other and young children and their families. And so thank you guys for highlighting that initially, and for making that really the foundation of where we talk about UDL. And so we're going to do a little bit of a shift because we have a couple more things to talk about. But what we've done and what I've seen you all do in your work is connect. We have these great foundational documents through of the organizations in which we partner. And there are likely organizations that we haven't included. And so please, if you have that role, we would love in this little community for you to share with us. To make sure that we're all, we're aware of these things, and it can grow our practice as well. And we have recommended practices and professional standards, and then we have universal design for learning. And so what I hear you guys saying is that UDL gives us a framework in which to support all of these things and to implement them together. Mm-hmm. And so I've heard we've talked about it a little bit, but how specifically do you guys see the connection between equity and UDL in early childhood?
I think the basic answer is that UDL removes the barriers that prevent access to learning for children or learners of any age. A good, solid, well-implemented UDL framework removes the barriers because we have the multiple means of representation, engagement, and action and expression. And so the UDL framework doesn't make things equal, but it makes things equitable so that everyone who walks in the door has the opportunity to learn and be joyfully engaged in learning.
I'm going to throw out just a slightly different, I totally agree with what you just said, Marla, but another perspective to think about UDL in early childhood, and it's one that I've written about a lot over the years and presented often, is that I actually think that early childhood educators have in many ways been doing UDL from the get-go. It is so fundamental to the way that as an early childhood educator, and I'm not talking about myself here as an early childhood special educator, which is certainly part of my background and training, but really about working with young children. When we look at what we know about supporting the learning and development of each and every child that we encounter, first of all, in early childhood settings, we have a range already, whether or not there is a child that has been identified through sort of our medical model, been identified as having a special need. The reality is we have this incredible range. We have these things here in Kansas that, you know, that we have they're called, they used to be called 4-year-old at risk classrooms. They're now called preschool, Kansas preschool programs. So they're for 4-year-old children. And the reality is they have to be 4 by September 1st or something like that. Well, the reality is you're going to have a child that just barely made the cutoff and is 4, and you're going to have a child who the next day turns 5. The difference between 4 and 5, you've got this range. And so what I like to say to early childhood educators when I talk about universal design for learning is pat yourself on the back. We've just now given you a structure to pat yourself on the back that these are practices that you do. And one of the things I've often done is I've turned the sequence around in terms of universal design for learning and said, you know, basically first it is means of representation, and then it's engagement, and then it is means of expression. Is that right? Yeah, sorry, can't believe I just lost that. Showing my age. But because then it becomes this teaching sequence. I mean, that's what we do. That's the teaching sequence. And then when we think about, you know, the things that you were talking about, Marla, in terms of means of engagement, one of the primary strategies we can use is choice, giving children choice. We have known forever that in early childhood, that's a strategy that we use. So many of the strategies that we use to intentionally teach in early childhood are strategies that fit perfectly in that UDL framework. And, I think by having that structure, it not only is a way for us to pat ourselves on the back that we do this, but it also then opens up our creativity to be able to go beyond sort of and really much more intentionally think about, have I really addressed all those? So
yeah, I love, Eva, your like the emphasis on intentionality. I think that's really where it can be so affirming, right? When we do trainings on UDL or talk to teachers and coach around UDL, because they're like, wait, hold on. Like I've always been doing this. I've always been using props and musical instruments in my circle. And you're like, that's incredible. There's multiple ways that kids can participate in that. They must be so much more engaged. Like, way to go. And we can celebrate that with folks. And I appreciate the mention of intentionality. I think that's such a key thing, right? And we, as a field, we're so good at doing that planning and it looks effortless, right? Like you see these incredible classrooms and you know that teacher had made these decisions about the implementation of UDL and the modification of some of these activities to support certain kids. But but it's not always transparent because it's really good planning that, as James points out in the chat, like so many people are just doing naturally because we have oftentimes mixed aged classrooms. Another way I think it can be really powerful and important for us to think about UDL is the connection between anti-racist and anti-bias practices. And I'm really appreciating colleagues that are putting more of this out into the field so we can have these continued conversations about when we think about representation and students coming into our programs and families coming into our programs with different funds of knowledge, there's a really clear opportunity for connection here. And, I appreciate the alignment between like the Emily Stiles' work with windows and mirrors and how we can think about that in our classrooms and talk to pre-service and in-service teachers about, ways in which all members of our communities see themselves represented in our materials, in our books, and the information that's going home to families and in the home languages that are posted in our classrooms. And I would, encourage us and challenge us to think about not only the race and ethnicity, the different identity markers that folks come in, but we're all inclusion people. We're all thinking deeply about supporting children with disabilities or children that are served within IFSPs and IEPs. And I think our field, like we're still trying to get better at ensuring the representation of individuals with disabilities within our programs, right? So our learners that do identify as disabled have these role models, and we're trying to push back on these ableist systems. So I think when we think about equity and UDL, there's also opportunities for us to think deeply about the anti-racist practices and the anti-bias framework that our colleagues at NAEYC have done such a beautiful job talking to us about, and created so many great tools that we can be using in classroom practices. But I've found, I had the incredible pleasure of teaching a course on UDL before I came back to the Herring Center, and a really powerful assignment that we did with those pre-service candidates was asking them to kind of pick a student in your classroom, in your fieldwork placement, right? Everyone was doing a fieldwork placement that comes from a non-dominant group, from a group that has historically been marginalized by systems of public education, and now do an audit through the materials in your classroom and in your school. And where is this individual represented? And for a lot of students, they hadn't yet had the chance to think about that. And it led to some really wonderful and important conversations in this class and action plans about what they would be doing as pre-service teachers and in-service teachers to ensure that representation. So I see a connection there too. I'm curious if colleagues here have thought about that or pushed on that a little bit as well.
Well, I just want to say, yes, you said that so eloquently that there's no way that I'm going to add anything to it, but oh no, it is so critical. And this whole concept of, really broadening our definition. In many ways, I think what you're suggesting is that we need to broaden our focus, particularly as early childhood special educators. We need to broaden our focus and our definition of inclusion, and that what we really are now talking about in terms of inclusion is multiple identities and the intersectionality of multiple identities that are occurring, that it is no longer just about including kids with disabilities. It really is really addressing. And again, I think UDL as a framework really promotes that notion, because I do think one of the problems, I shouldn't say problems, but one of the issues that we've had in terms of really seeing this idea of UDL, it's been around for a while, and yet we're still struggling with trying to make it become part of our everyday language, if you will. And one of the problems is that it is still often seen as something that special educators do.
Yes.
It doesn't belong to, and part of it I want to say is, no, it's not ours, it's yours. If we have to give it to somebody, it is general education. You guys can have it. You can take credit for it. It is, because that's where it really should sit. It is, again, I think early childhood has done a really great job in this. When I look at the professional standards and competencies that for early childhood educators, UDL is in there. It is an expectation that every early childhood educator be competent in universal design for learning. Now I've had some people say, oh, well, yeah, now I see that you were on the committee, but it wasn't just me. I did kind of push it, but again, I think that's one of the things that we need to advocate for, and we need to teach the students that we are preparing, whether we're doing a blended program or an early childhood special ed program or doing an early childhood program. We need to get folks to advocate for that universal design for learning is a skill that every educator needs to have. And often, I know particularly in the primary grades, when we talk about supporting a range of learners, we talk about differentiation. Well, to me, differentiation and modifications are an individual where you start looking at how do I support these individuals with their different kinds of needs and strengths, et cetera. Universal design for learning comes first. And so if we could get all of the quote general educators doing UDL and being competent in UDL, and then, so anyway, you got my soapbox. I'll stop. But
no, I think that's key though, Eva. Marla, what do you think?
I was just going to say, I love what you said about it not being a special ed thing, because that is a conversation I've been having a lot recently. Is when we look at the research, we look at who's doing these presentations, all three of us come from a special ed background. Mm-hmm. And I love that, but I was having a conversation with a colleague the other day. How do we pull in our gen ed colleagues? Because this isn't us. We shouldn't own this. And I completely agree. UDL is for everyone. The differentiation is for our students with disabilities or our students who have specific needs. And where I see the biggest challenge, because I work preschool and up, is those early elementary, those first, second, and third. The moment we start talking about multiple means of, I hear from teachers, oh, well, that's not us. We don't do that. We just teach the mainstream. And so I think as a teacher educator, that's where I see the struggle. It's not in the preschool and kindergarten classrooms, because those teachers are rocking it and they are doing the UDL. The challenges I'm seeing, and where I'm seeing we're struggling to really get UDL in the classroom and address those equity issues, is especially for our special educators or our teachers who are, in a K-5 classroom or something along those lines, where they aren't hearing it. They're not hearing it. It's not being discussed in the same way we're talking about all of these things with our preschool and kindergarten. I would also say, I was thinking about, I think as Ariane was talking, that a good UDL framework also helps us address the equity issues with families. And it helps us because we have multiple ways that we communicate with families, and we have multiple ways that we engage and interact with families, instead of it being, here's the classroom newsletter that goes out every single Friday, and that's how I communicate with families. A good UDL framework has us communicating and engaging with families in ways that meet their needs and address any barriers that might exist to our more traditional ways of collaboration.
Mm-hmm. I hear you. So I mentioned earlier, I focus a lot on those early elementary grades. I'm going to keep plugging our community, because I've got people texting and chatting, and I can see some participant lists, and that a lot of these folks in quote traditional general education, or who are training in traditional education, or who doing innovative work in the nonprofit sector, are doing a lot of this. Thanks for our chat person. The community link is in the chat. Is that I feel like I have this beauty because I was trained in both areas. And so I sit, Eva will laugh. I almost sit on the seesaw of a lot of different things, because I'm on this school age, early childhood transition, where do I sit? And then I also sit in this general education versus special education, which in early childhood, we're really good at blending it. And I think that there are folks out there doing this, but I think that we're not in community together. And so we're not talking about each other. And so we're running these parallel silos, and innovation is perhaps occurring in each of them. But wouldn't it be great if we could have that innovation and pull those silos together and start to really have that connection and collaboration? And to be able to say, there was a school age webinar too, right? Part two is this series on purpose, to try to say, hey, we've got folks in now, let's talk about it. And I think talking about differentiation, and so was the thing I've perseverated on in the last 10 minutes. So I am really fortunate. Eva and I are in the same university. And so I am able to teach the kindergarten to second grade supportive instructional methods course. And so I get all these students who have had all these awesome conversations and training, and I get them at the very, very end in between student teaching. And so they've been in a classroom, they've had all these practicum experiences, and this idea of differentiation, I don't have any data to back this up, so this is just what I do in fieldwork and in coursework, is we say, okay, I have this student and here's what I did to support them individually. And then how cool would it be if we take those adaptations or those environmental supports and we say, now put that in your toolkit to pre-plan and to be preventative. And let's build the toolkit and use UDL as our framework to say, I'm already going to have this thing that perhaps I did as an adaptation, as a responsive adaptation to a student who wasn't engaged or who wasn't able to access the instruction or the social relationships, or a student who said, this is not working for me, and you co-collaborated a way to make it better. And so each time we learn from a new experience, instead of it being in that reactive, which is also incredibly important and effective, we now make it in our proactive box and expand there. And I think that a lot of those conversations, at least with the pre-service teachers that I teach, they have common sites for their practicum. So they'll say, I had Ariane in my class, and here were some things that were supportive of her that I figured out after the fact. Now I'm going to toss it to my colleague and say, you're going to have Ariane in your class next. Go ahead and preventatively plan all of these things. And guess what? More kids besides Ariane are going to access it. And so then when I go to teach that unit again in first grade, or in second grade or in third grade, I taught on the East Coast, so I have very specific standards that I would have taught in second grade. Or in first grade, if we're doing friendly numbers, so how do I make friendly numbers for my addition facts? Well, I made this in response to a student, so let's pop back over and have it there. Or I was really fortunate to partner with a speech language pathologist. And so she would help me create materials. And then while they were reactive and responses to an individual student wants, that's going to work for a lot of kids. And so I'm just going to put it in my arsenal to start with. And I'm going to teach multiple strategies and have students self-assess and reflect, whether it's at the higher ed classroom or in the first grade, second grade, third grade classroom. And then they're going to pick the strategy that works best because it gets them to the same ends, but they can decide which one works best. And so we have just about 8 minutes left, and I have a couple more things I want to do. So maybe to end, if you all would each be willing to share one explicit experience. I'm going to ask you, Ariane, to maybe, if you're willing to share with the community your the assignment that you talked about where you had students identify a student from a non-majority identity. I think I want to add that in my classwork and in my training. But maybe if each of you could share one thing that you do either in your coursework or in your fieldwork, particularly around UDL, whether it's how you present content in your particular classroom or how perhaps an assignment. And then we can maybe add that into our community and start to share some of those tangible things that can help us move this forward. Or you can say your final thought that you want everyone to know.
I can't come up with one thing.
Sure.
But and many people may already know about this. It was just something that I fairly recently found that I used this fall at the very beginning of I'm teaching an instructional methods. It's called Inclusive Preschool Kindergarten Instructional Methods. And universal design is definitely part of the continuum of instructional practices that we're working on. And I learned about a video that was, oh, wait a minute, I wrote it down because I thought I'm going to get to share it. It's about the bowling analogy. Has anybody used that one? It comes out of Canada, and it's actually been out for a while. I thought I newly discovered it, but it's Shelley Moore, and I can type that. Oh, yep, somebody got it in the chat already. The Shelley Moore. She does a whole bunch of podcasts. She's just wonderful in terms of her expressions and the way she does it. But the first one that I showed, she actually has some newer ones out as well. And it's called the 7-10 split. And it provides an analogy of bowling. And I used to bowl years and years ago. Actually was pretty good at it. But the 7-10 split is basically what happens if you bowl right down this, if you make the ball go right down the center, you're going to get the 7-10 split. And it is so hard to pick up those pins on the either end. And she just does this wonderful job of using that as an analogy about how important it is to consider the edges of, you know, both the upper edge and the lower edge. And it's just an amazing, it just kicks people off in terms of really lively discussions. My undergraduate students were just so enthralled. And I think, you know, it's in some ways it's a great UDL experience because it could connect to people's experiences. It made it, oh, well, yeah. So anyway.
That's awesome.
And I think I see the link. Did Jamie put that link in?
He did. No, this is why we need community. This is why we want people to join this community, is that we have this thing that we know, and then look, all these other people jump in and now we all have access to it. Okay, yeah. That's a great one.
Yeah. So she has a whole series, and she literally just put up maybe 2 or 3 months ago. No, actually this fall, one called Removing Barriers, Planning for All. But the bowling one you have to watch first if you haven't seen any other ones. But anyway.
Awesome. Marla, what about you?
So my program is fully asynchronous online. So one of the things I spend a lot of time focusing on, go back to what we talked about earlier, the relationship piece. And when our students don't see me ever, I often find that they sometimes aren't as committed as we might want them to, right? Like, because I just am an imaginary face on a screen. And so I spend a lot of time looking at ways I can engage learners, and that multiple means of engagement is a huge part of what I do as a higher ed faculty member. So at the beginning of every class, I call every single student. The first time they're in my class, they panic a little bit because your professor just called you and left you a message. By the time they're at the end of their program, I will call and I better block out 20 minutes to talk to each student because they're going to want to talk forever, which is really awesome. And it's, you know, a really positive piece. But I spend a lot of time with engagement. So I call them, I text them, I send emails. I use a lot of memes in our course announcements. But I really spend a lot of time focusing on that engagement piece and building those relationships and getting to know each of them as individual learners. And I feel like when we're looking at higher ed, especially when we're looking at the asynchronous coursework, we can't do the rest of it, and we cannot do effective instruction if we haven't built those relationships. And so I would say that's where the UDL framework starts in my program and in my coursework, is engaging my learners and building the relationships. And once I've done that, their learning is just huge. And their engagement in the program and their persistence in the program is huge once we've started to engage them.
Mm-hmm.
Ariane, how about you?
Yeah, you know, the Windows and Mirrors assignment was a really fun one. I'm so happy to share that. I'm thinking about, we haven't talked as much about like assignments and ways that students are demonstrating their learning. I mentioned earlier, I've been teaching this class on autism and related social communicative disorders for, I think I've taught it 12 times. And we, a couple of years ago, kind of developed a new assignment that we called Autism in the Community. And the idea, you know, in the Seattle area, there's a lot of stuff around us. But I wanted, you know, students to get out of the walls of our College of Education and into like what families and individuals with autism are engaged in our community. So had some different options of things they could do. There's a lot of, you know, museums and zoos and aquariums in this area that do early open events for families of kids with disabilities. I invited them to attend that. Our, you know, baseball team has like an autism night out, though I think we could critique that and really wonder like, yeah, we branded this, but did we provide any actual support? So that's kind of the assignment. Go out into the community. You can go to a lecture. You can sit in on a parent group if they are comfortable with you being there. You can attend an early open event. You can go for a day out for autism at the Mariners. You can go to an AMC sensory friendly movie, but I wanted them to experiencing things in our community that they might recommend or not recommend to families and individuals with disabilities themselves. And that's kind of been a really interesting assignment over the years. COVID made things difficult. We had to kind of transfer that to different online meetings and things like that. So, one thing maybe folks in this space might consider is if there are opportunities to bring our assignments outside of the classroom. So students, as Marla mentioned earlier, like have, you know, some opportunities to engage in choice there, but then really ground this in like the funds of knowledge outside textbooks and ensure that people have the opportunities to get to know what's happening within the spaces where individuals with disabilities and their families are spending time. And yeah, over the years, it's been a really funny thing to grade. It's been a really funny thing to learn more about. And then also kind of like I had students reach out to organizations and be like, hey, I'm wondering, like, we're doing this for families with kids with disabilities. Have you had a chance to think at all about including social stories or maybe some visual supports or like a video tour before we come to the aquarium? Because we know that these are some inclusionary practices that might be helpful. So that might be something that folks in this community and across CITL would be interested in thinking or talking more about.
Yeah. So these are just 3 examples. I have 2 pages of notes of things that I want to know more about. And so as our webinar is wrapping up, it's the top of the hour, we really encourage everyone so that we can continue these conversations that have happened in the chat, or if you're joining us asynchronously so we can connect. We really encourage you to join our CITL community. And I want to thank all of our panelists for joining us today. Thank you for putting it in the chat, and we'll make sure that it's available for everyone as well. But our next step is we've started to form some connection, and we want to take this next step to be able to talk about it further. What are tangible assignments? What are some of these foundational documents that we've mentioned today? How can I connect with the panelists? I might not know them, or the article about circle time, for example, in UDL. And I know that Eva has mentioned also some position statements and new personal practice standards we have for early intervention and early childhood. And for our folks who are here who are in early childhood or who are in related service professions, I know Eva's speech language pathologist. I'm really excited. I want to be able to have us connect and to start to form those relationships so that then we can start innovating in higher ed. So we're really excited for everyone to join us. If you are a part of CEDAR, and you're an early career scholar or faculty member, that particular group is meeting right now in connection with CITL in your typically occurring meetings. So some of us will be there, and we'd love to see you there. And then our next webinar is going to be on December 8th. And we are talking about the range of technology in early childhood and K-12 and how we can start to integrate that or consider that in our practice. I know we had some suggestions today in this webinar. So December 8th is the next time to joining our community. All of our events are posted there. And so I really hope, and I can't wait to jump in the community today and extend this conversation. So Marla and Eva and Ariane, thank you all so much for spending the time with us today. Everyone synchronously, thanks for joining us. And folks asynchronously, we look forward to connecting with you all in our community. Enjoy the rest of your day.